Are consequentialism or deontology appropriate philosophies for examining the world? I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. What matters more, the means or the ends? This age-old question is really exemplified by these two battling ideologies. On one hand, you have consequentialism, which solely focuses on the ends or the outcomes of your actions. On the other, you have deontology, which hones in on the means that you use. It doesn't care about what happens after that. Which one of these, if any, is appropriate? Spoiler alert, I think that they're both wrong, and that's why I call them the duo of blindness. I'll spell out the reasons why I feel this way in due time, but first let's begin by breaking down the theory of consequentialism. Formally, it's described as believing that consequences of one's conduct are the ultimate basis for any judgment about the rightness or wrongness of that conduct. And actually, before I even go further, I want to point out, these theories may seem baseline or simplified, but you'd be surprised by how many people actually abide by them in some form or another. They might come across as stupid as we're dispelling some of the false beliefs they have, but if you really pay attention, there are people out there who abide by these principles. So, as I said, that's the definition of consequentialism. It only regards the ends as anything worthy of recognition. So for something to be right, it'd have to be a morally good outcome. For example, me helping somebody or relieving some form of pain, and for something to be wrong, the outcome would have to be inflicting pain or something along those lines. How they came about doesn't really matter because what you've done is either good or bad. Consequentialism, in a sense, transcends laws and rules though, which is what deontology is all about. They are fundamentally opposed to each other. So, under this theory of consequentialism, you can break any rules you want, as long as the outcome can be reasonably deemed as good. For example, if there is a law that prohibits me from jaywalking, under something like deontology, I wouldn't be able to break that law because it'd be immoral under any circumstance, regardless of what happens. But with this theory here, the consequentialist would say, if you break the law, but the outcome is good, it's moral. So if I jaywalk to pick somebody up who's fallen on the road and is about to get hit, that's fine. Forget about the law. What's important is what you've done. A more complicated example of this might involve the military. There are strict rules that revolve around not disclosing top secret information, but if I come across something that spells out a plan that's going to have collateral damage and I leak that to ensure the villagers flee the scene, well, according to this, that is morally acceptable, and I shouldn't be held accountable for my actions because the outcome is good, even if I broke some laws along the way to enact that. Now, under this umbrella of consequentialism, you have a bunch of sub-philosophies which all play off that central theme of outcome-based thinking. You have something like state consequentialism. The idea here is that your actions are judged solely based on how much they contribute to your state, the outcome. That is very communist-esque, comrade. For example, if I kill somebody, but it's good for the state, like let's say they were someone who opposed the government, it's all good then, because my action did something in favor of the state. The means don't matter. If you kill somebody, it's fine. You've reached your end goal. Now, at this point, you may be starting to sense some issue with this line of thinking. I'll clear that up after one more example. There is also something called utilitarianism, which is quite popular. It posits that actions that maximize happiness and well-being for the most amount of people are paramount. This brings into question, though, whether happiness should really be our ultimate aim. Well-being makes sense depending on how you want to define it, but this rationale could easily give way to utopian malevolence or some type of reality like Brave New World where everyone is hooked up to some type of drug that presents them with this happiness and improved well-being, but they miss out on freedom. My burning issue with these outcome-based philosophies, though, is that they are far too rigid. They needlessly fixate on a single component of a complicated equation, and they put all their chips on that. The reality is, not everything boils down to outcomes. To live like this is foolish. It disregards any concept of the means. Only the ends matter. That's borderline willful blindness in what these philosophers would consider positive outcomes. They don't care what you do to get there. They only care that you get there. The means are just as, if not more important than the ends in some cases. Here's an example to illustrate that lack of nuance. Let's say that there are two people. Actually, no. Let's say there are two situations. In situation A, there is somebody who is my friend, someone who likes me, but I'm crossing the street when I shouldn't be, and it's not favorable visibility conditions as fog and whatnot, and my friend then hits me with their car. That is situation A. Now we have situation B. Let's say that's me and someone who hates me. They want to kill me. They hate everything that I stand for, and they deem me to be some sort of plague on the earth. So they see me walking, even given the same conditions, but they notice that it's me. Then they hit me with their car. The outcome in both situations is the same, but you would have to be a fool to regard them in the same light. In both cases, I've been hit with a car. It's very likely that I'm going to have to go to the hospital, and there are some bones that have been broken that need attention. The morality of the two situations, though, is vastly different. On one hand, somebody didn't intend to hit me, but they still hit me. On the other hand, somebody wanted to do it. Somebody actively sought the opportunity to hit me, and they took it. For me to simply look at the outcome and say, yeah, these are both the same thing, is blind. At the same time, it creates an issue here, where I am not taking into account the motive of people, and therefore, I am not understanding what they are likely to do in the future. For me to take my friend in example A, who hit me, and say, hey, it's okay, why don't you come over for dinner tonight, and we can just hang? That would be logical, because I understand, or I'm inferencing, their motives. I understand they didn't mean to do that, it was an accident. I can use that knowledge to better inform my future decisions. But, in example B, if I did the same thing, if I went to the person who hated me, who wanted to kill me, and I said, hey, why don't you come over for dinner tonight? That would be a foolish move, it would be stupid. But, given this philosophy, you are kind of boxed into that. You only should care about the ends regardless of the means. That is not logical. Here is another example. Let's say I'm the head of a country, and in situation A, I have an ally, people who are progressive and who are free thinkers, but during a practice session, they accidentally drop a bomb on one of my assets, on my submarine. They blow it up. How about in example B now? I have another country who hates me. They openly proclaim to be against everything I stand for, and they want to destroy my nation. If they come forward and blow up my submarine, and they proclaim it was an accident, or whatever, it doesn't really matter in this case because the means are irrelevant. Should I treat those as the same? Should I not take into account any context? Should I solely focus on the ends here? It was a bad outcome. It was negative. In both situations, one of my assets was blown up. Despite that, only a fool would treat the situations as the same. In situation A, you are likely to not retaliate because you understand the morality there of your relationship. In situation B, though, you are more likely to retaliate because you understand the dynamics present. This worldview is simplistic and foolish. It actually doesn't effectively bode well for you making future decisions, number one, and number two, accurately analyzing the context of anything that happens to you. To the stark consequentialists, they see no difference in any of the examples I've given to you because the outcomes are the same. I'd make the case further that without taking into account any of the shades here, you just fool yourself from reality. It's a mechanism of hiding yourself from the deeper layers of what's really going on in the world around you. I will say this though, this way of thinking isn't always incorrect. There are actually a lot of situations, hence the nuance in the world, where this could be appropriate, but it shouldn't be regarded as a maxim. For example, World War II, America dropped a nuclear bomb on Japan. That was terrible, but it brought about the end of the war, possibly saving more lives. In this case, you can actually try to make a claim that consequentially it may have been the right thing to do, and even that's hotly debated. A less polarized example would be something like me simply, as I given the example before, breaking the law to save somebody. If somebody has just been shot and I need a blanket to apply pressure to their wound and I don't have one, if I go into the nearest bay and take a blanket off the rack without paying for it, but I save the person's life, that would be moral. You don't have to be bound by the means of getting the blanket because there is a more pressing issue at hand. My problem, though, is when people apply this broadly throughout their lives, it's just not feasible. And even with something like utilitarianism, which makes the case for maximizing happiness and well-being for the most amount of people, that's just calling for sacrifice at its core. What if the person who undertakes that mission does it at the expense of some minority of people? They build a utopia for some large segment by culling some smaller unit. The ways in which we bring about reality matter. Intentions matter. The means matter. But you need context too. To me, this philosophy is just idealistic, simplistic, and it fails to provide real-world value. In a utopia where people can be trusted to always undertake noble means to their actions, then maybe it holds some water. In reality, though, there is no such value. My fundamental claim really is that consequentialism is applicable in some cases, but it's incomplete. It cannot hold up to everyday usage because it's missing core components of reality. Of course, there are cases here and there where it can be relied upon, and I'm going to make the same case for deontology, but to use it all the time, to use that as the basis for your worldview is mistaken. And that's the perfect segue now into deontology. I would regard this as consequentialism's twin. So at this point, I think my beliefs are surfacing. I don't buy into any univariable, absolutist philosophies. I believe in the nuance. I believe it's important. Deontology is another breed of absolutism. Deontology, or deontological ethics, judges the morality of an action based on whether it conforms to a series of rules. That's it. The consequences of your action don't matter. This may be a little bit confusing, but here's an example to illustrate it. If I'm walking down the street and I see somebody who is dying of thirst, they're literally dying, they've come out of the desert and they need water. If I don't have water with me, and the only option is to steal it from the local Walmart, I wouldn't be able to do that given this deontology way of thinking. Because there are rules in our society. One of them is do not steal. For me to violate that would be immoral regardless of the outcome. Even if it saves the person's life, it would still not be worth it given this way of thinking. Now, you can see the difference. Consequentialism would tell you to take the water. It would say disregard the laws, forget about the means, produce the outcome you want to see, save the life. Deontology says forget about the ends, focus on the means. You can't break the law to do whatever it is you want to do. That is immoral. And that is the stark difference between the two. Deontology puts forward that we are duty bound. We have an obligation to follow the rules put before us. This complicates itself rather early on because the question of where the rules come from arises. I'd agree that certain core human maxims appear over time. For example, innately, we seem to know that killing family members is not appropriate. That's been true for most of human existence, otherwise, reproducing would have been way more challenging. I believe that as time flows, we expand deeper into the core message of that. Killing people within your group is wrong. It's a matter of expanding the in-group though. At one point, we went from only regarding your immediate family as those we shouldn't kill, to extending it to distant relatives, then to communities, then to nations, and eventually, I hope we reach a point where the in-group just becomes all of humanity. Killing a stranger is as abhorrent as killing a family member. That's the progression of these moral rules here. Things that are innate, things that we know and are duty bound to uphold. From things like that, we can extrapolate some reasonable laws about things like the legitimacy of murder, but for more nuanced issues that don't revolve around evolution, like data protection, we get stifled. Someone or some organization will create the laws for that. They're not innate. We aren't born with a sense of what's right and what's wrong with data. We may be duty bound to these rules, but that doesn't mean that they are inherently moral. To simply base the judgment on whether you are abiding by them or not is not correct. It's relative to the creator's intentions. You can be dealt a set of terrible rules. For you to simply abide by them through duty is blind. The rules could be bad. You have to be able to question that. When you hold a set of rules as absolute, you better ensure that they are perfect, because if they aren't, you're going to be led down a dark path. Religious fundamentalists fall into this trap all the time. You effectively enslave yourself to measures that are not going to produce the outcomes that humanity and the world desire. To not be able to break away from that type of duty is the death of mobility. To deeply believe that you can't break the rules even if the outcome is good or desirable leaves you cemented in a path of nonchalance, of you letting evils happen because you are so duty-bound to the means. As you see here, we have a philosophy that fixates solely on the means, or rather the motives or the intentions of an action. They don't care what the ends are. If you can save a life by breaking the law, they don't want that. The means of breaking the law is far too immoral. Now, Immanuel Kant is probably the biggest proponent of this thinking. He refines the theory somewhat by adding two conditions. The first is that people must act from duty. One way to derive that is from rules or moral laws. The second is that it's not the consequences that matter, but the motives. He argues that good consequences can occur by accident from a bad actor. You can have a dictator who enslaves his country, but as a result, he reduces pollution. You're not going to say that's moral. The intentions matter. At the same time, you can have someone who means well, but does something terrible. Somebody who wanted to fix your car for free, but he messes up and destroys it. The morals and the intentions do count there. He didn't want to destroy your car, but unfortunately, that was the outcome of his goodwill. As you can see, this is the counterexample to what we just talked about in the previous case with things like consequentialism. If you derive duty from laws and then act with good intentions, you are fine regardless of the outcome. The first issue here is the same as with the overarching ideology. Who decides which laws we derive duty from? Is it Nazi Germany, where you are obliged to commit genocide through a code of conduct and the culture surrounding you? Is it having a great intention of bringing about utopia by finding yourself amidst gulags and concentration camps? We cannot dispose of the means or the ends. We need them both. They both matter. Finding the balance is difficult, but fixating on one or the other is a disaster. The Communist Manifesto spells out great intentions in some parts to dispel hierarchy, to bring about equality, to make everyone thrive. Using Kant as the frame of reference here, we would be morally obliged to consider that good, to consider the actions of the Communist Manifesto and the outcomes to be something moral. Unfortunately, though, the consequences matter, and that's not the case. Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, they rolled around using that ideology, and they brought havoc with them. At the same time, we can't always judge intentions perfectly either. It's an incomplete measure because we don't have direct access to those things. They're immaterial. These dictators may have proclaimed to have the best intentions for people, but how do we verify that? We cannot. It's either we take their word or we suspect that they are lying, but if we think they're lying, how do we prove that? Let's say they really did want to bring about utopia, and did so following the moral laws of bringing about justice and whatnot. They fit the two criteria, but nobody is going to call them saints if they have any modicum of sanity. Because maybe their intentions were good, but the outcomes were bad. It's okay though. The intentions were good. No, we can't verify that, and even if it was true, the outcomes do matter. Millions of people died there. We can't give a pardon to the action because somebody thought it was a good idea. In a sense, this line of thinking does away with things like responsibility and accountability. You're not accountable to the outcomes of your actions because you simply thought that it would be better. No, you must be held accountable to that because you produced the outcome. Those dictators brought it about. To simply say they may have had good intentions, they were fighting for justice, equality, and whatnot, is not an effective pardon for what transpired. By doing that, you take away the onus from them and cast it into oblivion. That's a terrible mode of operation. In the abstract sense, I think Kant has some good points. Maybe, broadly speaking, if you simply just have good intentions and you follow the law, things will work out perfectly. But when you scrutinize his way of thinking and apply it to real-world circumstances, you encounter the nuance there. You realize that this ideology cannot cover the wide breadth of shades that we have to deal with. It just doesn't cut it because it doesn't realize the entire scope of the picture. Now, I must admit, I find Kant to be more refined than most of the consequentialists, but both of these philosophies are incomplete. If I had to debate somebody who was fully bought into the idea of consequentialism, I think that'd be easier than fighting somebody who is super enthralled with Kantism, because Kant really spelled out what he was trying to do, and he tried to account for the issues there, but to me, it's simply okay in the realm of ideas, but in the real world, it won't cut it. Both of these ideas do have their time and place though. There are going to be circumstances where it is appropriate to judge the ends even though the means were terrible, given alternate courses of action, and with something like deontology, there will be cases where the means matter more than the ends, but it's not absolute though. These things are fluid and they're going to change depending on the circumstance you find yourself in. To buy into a rigid ideology on how to view these things is a mistake. they needlessly, both of them, omit a key component of real-world operations. The means and the ends both matter. To not regard one of them is to be misinformed. In the title of the video, I refer to these ideologies as the duo of blindness, and I think that's highly appropriate to what they actually stand for. They're both operating with one eye closed. And for one of them, it's the left eye closed, and the other, it's the right eye closed. If left to their own devices, they would both be failures because they are missing a core component of just reality. But if you combine them, and you have both visions functioning appropriately, I wonder how that would be. Is there a way to combine something like Kantism with consequentialism? Maybe. And we might touch on that in a following episode. But for now, that brings me to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoy the content, be sure to leave a review and share. That'll help us grow. And you can also find me on Twitter and Instagram at PerryPlatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.